In the 20th century, more legislation was passed to control and regulate certain substances. It may surprise many that the first federal regulations of marijuana didn't occur until 1937. Harry Anslinger, who was the longtime head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was the precursor to the DEA, didn't really believe that the federal government should be involved in the regulation of marijuana. He believed that most of the trafficking in marijuana was local, that there wasn't much interstate trade in marijuana, that there wasn't very much interstate trafficking or international trafficking in marijuana. So he really thought this was a local issue that deserved to be attended to by the local authorities, the state authorities. Nevertheless, there were some influential figures in society that gradually changed his mind. William Randolph Hearst was a newspaper publisher who was a multi-millionaire. By today's standards, probably a multi-billionaire. If you've ever seen the movie Citizen Kane, it's loosely based on his life. But Hearst strongly believed that marijuana was a demon drug and that it was closely connected in his mind to the possibility of a Mexican revolution. Now, there was this thought going around that because marijuana was associated with Mexicans, at least in the public's mind, more than many other groups, that there was going to be a horde of Mexican revolutionaries who were going to be high on pot and storm across the border and cause a revolution within the United States. Now, this is probably pretty laughable to us today because we know that most people who are stoned on pot probably aren't ready to engage in a revolution. More likely to love everybody than to hate everybody and overthrow a government. But nonetheless, this was believed. And so we see this throughout the history of drug legislation. We see a connection between racism and drug policy, that when there's a need to punish something and there just isn't enough public support for it, it's often the case where someone will connect it to some particular racial group and cause greater fear because of the connection to that particular group. So racism has played a role in American drug policy. A classic example would be in the South in the 1930s, 1940s, and so forth, where there was this belief in a cocaine fiend. There was the racist belief that an African American man who was high on cocaine could not be stopped with a 32 caliber bullet, so police departments switched to 38 caliber. The belief was that this African American man who was high on cocaine would become a cocaine fiend and would rape and murder white women and white people. So again, there was this silly kind of racist notion about drugs and minority groups, and that these kinds of notions and beliefs were often used to stoke fear among whites to bring about new legislation. So we saw that with cocaine and African Americans, Mexicans and marijuana, Chinese and opium. We see this regularly throughout American drug history. Well, that was also true with marijuana back in the 1930s, and so Hearst was really, through his newspapers, promoting this idea of how bad marijuana was, not only for the possibility of Mexican Revolution, but also all kinds of made-up crimes, decapitations, murders, all kinds of things that were going on, supposedly connected to the use of marijuana, which really weren't true. The Mellon family also advocated for federal regulation. They were influential in the banking industry, and the DuPonts, who were just at the beginnings of developing plastic, probably had an economic interest in seeing marijuana more closely regulated because cannabis and hemp plants were mainly used for ropes and fibers and all kinds of other industrial uses that plastic could now replace. So if there was a way to connect some kind of evil criminal element to hemp through marijuana, then perhaps that industry would decline and the plastic industry that DuPont oversaw would grow. So they all urged prohibition, and eventually Harry Anslinger, who by the way was from Hollidaysburg and lived in Altoona, and donated his papers to Penn State Library, eventually agreed with them and eventually succumbed to the pressure and fought for the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act. I should mention also that there was other media like Reefer Madness a movie that you can watch online. I encourage you to watch it, which will leave you shaking your head. Because the belief is that if you start using pot, that right away you will go crazy, you'll perhaps murder, you may, as I said, go insane, you may um, see your life go completely down the drain and fall from being a productive member of society to someone who's a lost cause. So we see this kind of these fear tactics also in addition to racism. But the Marijuana Tax Act was eventually passed in 1937 to control marijuana. The reason it's a tax act is because the federal government didn't know how it could actually justify a marijuana regulatory law, because the federal government has to rely on some constitutional power. And because there wasn't much interstate trade in marijuana, they didn't believe that they really had the power to regulate it. However, basing the regulation on a previous law that regulated machine guns, what the what the federal government did was it used its taxing powers to say, well, if you want to possess marijuana, just like previously they'd said machine guns, if you want to possess it, you must produce your machine gun, or in this case, we're talking about marijuana, produce your marijuana, and pay a tax, and you'll get a tax certificate so that if you're ever stopped for possession of that marijuana, or previously a machine gun, then you can produce your tax certificate and you won't have any problems. But if you don't produce a tax certificate, you can be arrested for having not paid the tax. Well, the same thing that was done with machine guns was done with marijuana. So all you had to do to get that tax certificate was bring your marijuana with you to some federal office, produce it to them so they could measure how much tax that you had to pay, and then they would give you a certificate and you'd be okay. Well, the only problem was there were no certificates to hand out. The government never intended to really allow people to pay the tax, so this was essentially entrapment. Bring your marijuana down to the federal office. You're trying to comply with the law, you're trying to pay the tax, but then when you get there, the officials will say, we have no tax certificates, you can't pay the tax, and now we're going to arrest you for being in possession of marijuana that has no tax certificate. So it's certainly a catch-22, and it seemed like entrapment, but for over 30 years, this was the law that regulated marijuana. In 1969, the Supreme Court eventually declared the law unconstitutional, finding that it was entrapment to force people to basically break the law in order to try to comply with it and punish them for not being able, by making it impossible to comply with the law, arresting them. This the court found again to be entrapment. In 1961, the United Nations passed an important treaty, which was the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. And this requires everyone who has signed on to the convention, which is essentially the whole United Nations, to make a list of substances illegal. Included in that list are things like marijuana, heroin, LSD, cocaine, etc., etc., etc. So each country must make those substances illegal. However, the treaty says nothing about what should be done as far as people, as far as punishment or arrest or anything else towards the people who may break these laws. So there's nothing that says that you actually have to ever arrest anyone under your laws. It just says, the convention just says you must make these substances illegal in your country, but then the convention doesn't say anything about actually following through and enforcing those laws. So you can do like the Dutch have done, and you've watched a couple of videos about the Dutch coffee shops. In the Netherlands, marijuana is still illegal because of the 1961 Single Convention and Dutch laws that were passed as a result of that. However, the Dutch official policy is if you possess small amounts of marijuana, you will not be arrested. So in effect, the Dutch have essentially made marijuana legal, but they haven't changed their laws to make it officially legal. Technically speaking, marijuana is still illegal in the Netherlands, but the Dutch have decriminalized and have made it their official policy no one will be arrested for possessing recreational amounts of marijuana. Because the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act was struck down in 1969, the federal government needed to create a new drug law, and that drug law was the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which is still in place today. What that law does is create 5 different schedules of drugs. Schedule 1 drugs are the most dangerous and cannot be possessed at all. They can't be prescribed by a doctor, they can't be possessed. They are considered the most dangerous drugs, going all the way down to Schedule 5. Schedule 5 substances are still regulated, but they have many medicinal uses and are quite commonly used in society. So we'll take a look at these as we go through the Controlled Substance Act. Schedule 1, as I said, contains the most dangerous drugs according to the federal government. These include substances that have no accepted medical uses and a high potential for abuse, both psychological and physical dependence. On the list are such things as heroin, LSD, peyote, ecstasy, methaqualone, and you see here marijuana. Now, obviously, marijuana doesn't fit in this list. There are accepted medical uses. There is very little chance for psychological and physical dependence, but nonetheless, marijuana is considered one of the most dangerous drugs under the Federal Controlled Substance Act. What's the logic behind that? Well, our best guess is that Richard Nixon was pretty paranoid about the counterculture and the protesters who were in the streets in the late 1960s. And so even if he couldn't stop them for protesting against the Vietnam War, and he couldn't stop them for protesting for greater civil rights, the chances are somebody in their group probably had some marijuana and they could be arrested and face some pretty significant punishments as a result. But as it stands, marijuana is a Schedule 1 substance, and so doctors under the federal sentencing scheme can't even prescribe it. Schedule 2 substances are less dangerous, but are still very dangerous. They don't have quite as high a risk as Schedule 1 for abuse, but they do have a high risk for abuse, and they do have some accepted medical uses. Cocaine, we can see methamphetamine, Ritalin, Adderall, OxyContin, all these are on the list of Schedule 2. For the test, just realize that cocaine is a Schedule 2 substance. For Schedule 1, remember heroin and marijuana. So under the federal scheme, cocaine is less dangerous than marijuana. So let that sink in. The federal sentencing, or the federal control regulatory system says marijuana is more dangerous than cocaine. Schedule 3, we're not going to go through all these word for word, but these are less dangerous drugs, more accepted medical uses. And so we can see they include things like Vicodin, Tylenol with codeine, steroids, testosterone, things that could be prescribed. Schedule 4, even less dangerous, less chance for abuse, more accepted medical uses. So these are things that may be prescribed for sleeplessness, like Ambien. We might have, again, you can see the list here. Many of you probably have, there are probably several of you who have used some of these, Valium, Soma, Xanax, any of these kinds of substances. So you can be prescribed. They are controlled, so they're not just over the counter. They are controlled. There are some additional requirements on doctors who prescribe them. They have to take extra steps to make sure that these aren't being illegally sold. But beyond that, you can get access to these substances through your doctor. And then lastly, Schedule 5 are the least regulated of the controlled substances. And so we can see that they have very low potential for abuse, and they have medical applications. So on this list, we'll see things like cough medicines that contain some codeine. So Robitussin AC, and then you can see some of the others that are listed here. I won't ask you to remember all these, but Schedule 5 has the least dangerous drugs of the 5 schedules. And that is our federal regulation of drugs at this particular point. We have some other statutes as well, but the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 is the main regulation that's in place today in the federal system.